Here, Marine. That's an order. Take it!
What if, in this scene, the infection forms were just hugging the Marines?
This is it, baby. Hold me.
Okay, well, all jokes aside, today we're once again venturing into an alternate Halo timeline, one where the Flood were never our enemy. Instead, they were our closest ally. But that's insane, right? That could never happen. Well, actually, technically no. Let's create some context. How does such an impossibility become reality? Well, it all begins during the outbreak on Alpha Halo. Things go as per usual. The Covenant break into the facility, they cause a containment breach, and then Keyes, Johnson, and the other Marines follow them down thinking that it's some kind of weapons cache, only to discover the Flood. Except this time, they aren't hostile. Obviously the humans are freaked out at what they're seeing, but the Flood immediately present themselves in a visibly non-hostile manner, and so none of the Marines start firing. Instead, through methods of communication that are well above my pay grade as a YouTuber, the Flood start to speak to the humans and inform them of their wish to form an alliance thanks to their common enemy, the Covenant. You see, the Flood know that they need to reach the coordinator stage of evolution before they can leave the ring, and if they fail to do so, then they risk almost certain destruction. And thus, the Covenant's intent to fire the Halo poses the ultimate threat to both the Flood and the humans. And so, with common ground found on the brink of destruction, Keyes shakes hands with a carrier form, and a historic alliance between humanity and the Flood is struck. Immediately upon the alliance, the containment facility is turned into a bloodbath. A blue and purple bloodbath, mind you. Keyes, Johnson, Mendoza, Jenkins, and the hordes and hordes of Flood tear through the Covenant soldiers that are still left within and make their way to the surface, where they run into Master Chief, who just arrived in the swamp after comms were lost with Keyes. He's a bit freaked out at the sight of his new allies at first, but he quickly comes around to it when Keyes tells him that they're going to help him stop the Covenant, which right now is Chief's only concern. As this incredibly strange band of merry men continue to slaughter what little Covenants still remain in the swamp, new challenges appear. Sentinels, who immediately focus the Flood, and 343 Guilty Spark. Just as he does in Halo 1, Spark teleports Chief up to the platform to give him a stern talking to, but this time it's not about the Index and firing the Halo. Rather, it's about how much of a grave mistake he's making allying with the Parasite. But of course, Chief doesn't listen, because like all the other humans, he sees this alliance as the only way to stop the Covenant, who, in his ignorance, he still deems to be the ultimate threat. And so, Spark has no choice but to try and kill him, but of course, he fails. This time, Chief didn't need no stinking Spartan laser. The combined force of all the Marines and the Flood as well tear Spark to pieces, wiping the first major character off the board in this timeline. So, the Flood are our allies and Spark is dead. That means that the library is officially off the cards, music to the ears of many. Because Johnson's team was never overwhelmed in the facility, that also means that Keyes is perfectly alive and healthy as well. So honestly, the rest of Halo 1's standard levels wouldn't really happen in this timeline. They're all focused on stopping the Flood, with the Covenant kind of becoming the secondary threat. But now that the Flood are officially our buddies, that entire act of the story just has no reason to exist. All that's left to do on Alpha Halo is annihilate the rest of the Covenant. And annihilated they would be. The UNSC's still rigid guerrilla force, combined with the Flood's ever-growing numbers, would prove impossible to counter, even for the Covenant, and even more so when you consider that they're being led by the combined intelligence and strategic power of not just Captain Keyes, but also the Proto-Gravemind. The alliance also means that Alpha Base would never fall either, because the main reason that fell was the Flood crawling out of vents undetected and infecting its inhabitants. So, the UNSC would retain a solid base of operations for the entirety of the conflict on the ring, and this is likely where Keyes, Wellesley, and other vital information crew would be stationed. Alpha Halo wouldn't be destroyed either. The Covenant would just be utterly overwhelmed on the surface, and eventually, the Flood would be able to spread off the ring and begin infecting their ships as well. A bit like you infecting the subscribe button right now. That was subtle, wasn't it? Go on, you know you want to. Speaking of infection, today's sponsor is here for the fellas to stop hair from infecting parts of the body that you don't want it. Manscaped. They've just released the brand new Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra with next-gen dual skin-safe blade heads and accompanied by an updated trimmer blade and interchangeable foil blade for enhanced performance. The updated trimmer blade features longer, wider, and more rounded teeth. Tough on hair, but smooth on the skin. And then the foil blade is designed for a much more closer shave, capturing even the finest of hairs for a truly flawless look. It's like two trimmers for the price of one, and the best part is you can even switch between the two blades on the fly. Honestly, it's even easier than bursting a horde of infection forms, and that's coming from me. The Lawnmower 5.0 even has a bigger LED light as well that accommodates a variety of skin tones, so you know precisely where you're aiming it. And best of all, unlike the Master Chief, it's waterproof. So head on over to manscaped.com and get your hands on the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra today, and when you do, make sure to use my promo code XPERIA to get 20% off and also free international shipping. That's 20% off using my promo XPERIA at manscaped.com to contain the hair infection today. And this leads us to the events of Halo First Strike, which I think would play out kind of similar to the regular canon, except this time on anabolic brute tier steroids.
Good times.
Because of the overwhelming Allied victory on the ring, a significant majority of the Autumn's crew would have survived. Not just characters from Halo 1, but also major characters from the Flood as well, like the ODSTs Antonio Silva and Melissa McKay, and many, many more. Because of this, Linda is rescued from orbit with ease. She's not going to be chilling in a cryopod forevermore. And with the Flood running rampant throughout the Arbiter ships, I imagine that the Allied survivors would be able to take over one of those ships to use as a kind of base of operations in orbit and to plan their next move. The survivors no longer have to worry about capturing the Ascendant Justice either to get back to Reach because, well, the Arbiter's entire fleet of Particular Justice is basically done for at this point. And you know what? That makes it a good time to finally touch on the status of the Arbiter himself in this timeline. Now, as we already touched on, the Flood's rapid growth on the surface of the Halo enabled them to hijack ships and spread off the ring. Basically, what happened to the Infinite Succor in the regular timeline is now happening to the Arbiter's entire fleet. And so, it's here where I'm going to make the first rather unfortunate and extreme judgment call of this scenario. In the Flood's infection of the fleet, its flagship was entirely consumed, meaning that the then fell Vadami, whose failure at the Halo would make him Arbiter, is infected by the Flood along with all of his crew. And so, with a heavy heart, it pains me to say that the Arbiter is henceforth wiped from the timeline. Good night, sweet prince. You will be missed. Because of the sheer volume of biomass infecting not just the Covenant's ground force, but also their entire fleet yields, the Flood are able to construct a full Gravemind on Alpha Halo and officially enter the coordinator stage of evolution, vastly increasing their intelligence and lethality and marking Alpha Halo as their base of operations. But before we leave the Sol system and head back to Earth for the events of Halo 2, there's a loose end that we need to tie up. What happens to the heretics on the gas mine? Well, the reason they became heretics in the first place was because after they saw the Arbiter abandon them, Spark goes to the gas mine and basically just tells them the truth about their prophet's so-called great journey. That truth, of course, being that the entire thing is completely a lie. But now the Arbiter's fleet is in ruins and Spark's dead, so Caesar Reforme, the heretic leader, and his warriors would never become the heretics that we know them as. They'd likely just be stranded on that gas mine forevermore. That, or the Flood would find them and consume them. Pick your poison. So anyway, with that butterfly effect tangent over, with an entire hijacked Covenant fleet at their disposal, the UNSC survivors return to Reach to pick up Halsey, Admiral Whitcomb, Red Team, etc., and begin plans for Operation First Strike to take out the unyielding Hierophant and destroy Truth's 500-ship large Earth invasion fleet. Now, as is going to become a trend in this video, with the entire fleet of Particular Justice and its entire infected crew as allies, Operation First Strike is just an absolute breeze for the Allies. Not only is the mission overwhelmingly successful, the Hierophant destroyed, and Truth's 500 ship Earth invasion fleet almost entirely destroyed as well, but the Flood's infected numbers exponentially increase courtesy of all of the Covenant crew. You know, it's kind of like taking candy from a baby and then being rewarded with like 7,000 more pieces of candy for doing so. The way the Flood works in this timeline honestly feels like a cheat code. And so, with the events of Alpha Halo and First Strike out of the way, that brings us to Halo 2. Now, Regret's fleet is still out there. It's not been harmed so far by any of the damage that we've done to the Coveys. But of course, thanks to the joint hyper-intelligence of Keyes, the Alpha Halo Gravemind, and of course all the intel gathered from the Arbiter's fleet and the Hierophant, Earth is more than prepared for Regret's premature arrival. And when it arrives, it's yet another bloodbath. The joint human Flood Earth Defense Force utterly dismantles Regret's fleet. And ultimately, the Prophet of Regret is killed before a single one of his ships can even break through Earth's atmosphere. Now, Regret's death has a huge butterfly effect. I'm talking Ashton Kutcher levels. Because he's killed before he even reaches Earth's surface, that means that no portal is ever opened, and thus, nobody ever goes to Delta Halo. Obviously, the Amberclad never goes there because it never follows Regret, but also, neither does High Charity, because Regret is never on the ring to transmit its coordinates back to the Holy City. That has a major ramification a little later on. You might be able to guess what it is, but we'll get to it in a second. With Regret wiped from the timeline, nothing ever happens that sends anyone to Delta Halo. But with that said, that doesn't mean that Delta Halo plays no role in this timeline. In fact, quite the opposite. And it's all thanks to its Flood outbreak. You see, Delta Halo's Flood outbreak had absolutely nothing to do with our meddling or the Covenant's meddling or anything like that. In fact, it happened long before any of us even knew that Delta Halo existed. We don't know when it occurred specifically, but all we know is that it was caused by Penitent Tangent, the Ring's monitor. Now, because this outbreak was already in the coordinator stage, that means that the Gravemind on Alpha Halo will be connected to the Gravemind that we know on Delta Halo via neural physics. And you know, I don't think I need to tell you what the power and intelligence of two Graveminds means for the Flood. That kind of speaks for itself. However, there is a caveat to this. The Flood outbreak on Delta Halo was very much locked down within the quarantine zone, and because the Arbiter's no longer alive, that means that nobody's going to go and shut down the containment field and let all of them out like what we do in Halo 2. So, none of the actual Flood forms on Delta Halo will be able to leave the installation. The only assistance our allied Flood will get from Delta Halo is the intelligence of the Gravemind, which, granted, is probably stronger than any number of Flood forms put together, but still, none of them can really make it off the ring thanks to the quarantine zone still being intact. And you know, on that note, let's do a quick tally of all of the current Flood forces that are backing us up. Oh, prepare yourself. Our Flood allies are comprised of the dormant Flood in the containment facility on Alpha Halo, all of the Covenant ground forces from Alpha Halo, the entire fleet of Particular Justice and its crew, the crew of the gigantic unyielding Hierophant, the crew and likely many of the ships from Truth's 500 ship large Earth invasion fleet, and the crew and, again, likely many of the ships as well from Regret's Earth invasion fleet. So, yeah, at this point, our Flood allies are kind of unstoppable. The last remaining bulk of Covenant out there that pose any semblance of a threat is Truth's fleet that he comes to Earth with, the Stragglers from Operation First Strike. And in this timeline, honestly, I see no reason why he wouldn't still come to Earth. I mean, he still wants to light the rings and begin the Great Journey, and so he follows the coordinates to the Arc Portal that Regret's Luminary discovered and ends up at Earth just like normal. Except this time, his forces are actually greater than before, thanks to the presence of High Charity. Yep, the city is in fact still around. I mentioned this earlier, but now we get to elaborate. Because High Charity never goes to Delta Halo, which is where it got infected and overrun, it's still perfectly intact. And on the topic of High Charity, let's talk about the Great Schism, because I also don't think that that would happen in this timeline either. I think that Truth definitely would have planned it, but I think that even he would realize the Covenant honestly just couldn't afford to lose any more able-bodied warriors with how badly they're losing. He's just not in the position to suddenly usurp half of the effective fighting force of his military. And on a slight tangent, I also think that this means that the Hierarchs would never exile the legendary Zaitan Jar Watinri for the threat that he posed to them. In fact, in their desperation, I could honestly see the remaining Hierarchs just giving Zaitan even more power than he already had, letting him, I don't know, control the entire military, not just the navy or something like that. They'd be in full panic mode at this point. They would be in the position that we were in Halo 2 and Halo 3. To say that's the back foot would be an understatement. But even still, even with Zaitan commanding their forces, and even with High Charity still intact, I still think that Truth's invasion of Earth would be an ultimate failure. Earth's defense force, or... okay, I'm giving it a bit too much credence there. Really, I should say Earth's Flood defense force is just simply too great. They're honestly doing like all of the heavy lifting for us at this point, but the Flood's ability to bolster its own numbers with the corpses of its dead enemies is just, like I said earlier, it's a cheat code. That is frankly a cheat code. You can't beat them with that. Based on that tally of the Flood's armada that we did, could you imagine how many combat forms they'd have? How many pure forms? How many infected ships? I mean, I feel like at this point, we're reaching like 40k levels of scale here. Their numbers would be even too vast to count. The bottom line here, though, is that despite Truth's might, the Earth-Human Flood Defense Force would honestly just prove impenetrable. Truth, Mercy, and their Covenant would fall at the homeworld of their enemy, unable to even excavate the Portal of the Ark, let alone activate it, and the Human Flood Covenant War would officially be over. But don't worry, this video sure as hell ain't over. The Human Covenant War was a Pyrrhic victory in the regular timeline, but in this one, that's not really the case. I mean, yeah, we definitely took heavy losses from the start of the war up until Alpha Halo, but from then on, our losses would have been significantly lower, and in turn, our allied numbers would be significantly higher. Granted, because the Great Schism never happens, that means that we never ally with the elites, but honestly, the size of the Flood outbreak at this point would dwarf that of the Swords of Sanghelios and any other allied ex-Covenant faction. It's safe to say that at this point, again, as much as this pains my heart to say, the elites are kind of surplus to requirement. In the wake of the Covenant's defeat, a number of splinter factions would pop up across the galaxy and prove something of a nuisance for humanity, well, at least in the regular timeline. In this timeline, keeping galactic peace would be an absolute breeze, of course, thanks to the Flood's size and their reach. Major splinter factions like Julam Dharma's Covenant and the Servants of Abiding Truth wouldn't even stand a chance against us. I mean, the Flood's intelligence would make it impossible for them to hide on any distant colony or rock. And their numbers, I mean, dude, any conflict they even try and start, they're gonna get annihilated in the first day. Then there's the Banished. So, in the years surrounding the end of the war, the Banished weren't really doing much of note. They were still very much in their early days as a faction, just kind of going around raiding Covenant supply caches and maybe fighting small skirmishes here and there across the galaxy to increase their numbers and bring more into their ranks, but they really weren't that much of an imposing faction yet. And so, again, I think the Flood would quite easily find and deal with them. Deal in air quotes though, because I think there's a chance they could join our alliance. Don't forget, this is the early Banished. This is before the Banished hated humanity for some arbitrary reason. I mean, there are literally humans in the Banished, and they were never our arch nemesis like they seem to be in Infinite onwards, right? So I think there is a chance they could join our alliance, or of course the Flood could just infect them and wipe them off the board as well. You know what? I'll let you decide which one happens there. Now then, moving out of the immediate post-war years and into the more familiar era of Halo 4, because we never go to the Ark, that means that we also never go to Installation 08, and so Mendicant Bias never sends Chief to Requiem to awaken the Didact. You know, there's like a bittersweet irony there. The Didact's two mortal enemies, humanity and the Flood, have allied, and he's just napping through the entire thing. You know what, it's probably for the best that the Didact just stays napping in his Krypton, because I don't think seeing such an alliance play out would really do that much for his mental health that was already in the gutter at this point. And so, because the Didact never wakes up, that means that Cortana never has to sacrifice herself to defeat him, and so, in turn, she never finds a way into the domain and never becomes some omnipotent megalomaniac, and so, ultimately, the Created and their uprising never happen either. Man, you know what? All of a sudden, this timeline's not looking too bad. And as a result, we never go to Zeta Halo to war with her or the Banished. Halo 4, Escalation, Hunt the Truth, Halo 5, Halo Infinite, never happen. So, what the hell happens now then? Do we just rule the galaxy as invincible dictators, holding every colony under infection-based martial law if they ever step out of line? Well, no, actually. Our alliance with the Flood is dead-ended. You see, once the galaxy's kinda settled, so to speak, a major problem starts to arise. So, if we go back to the start, the reason the Flood allied with us in the first place was to ensure their survival from the Covenant, who, like the Foreigners, wanted to light the Halos and destroy them. However, not only are the Flood self-centered in everything they do, say, or arrange, they're also incredibly primal, driven solely by the hunger to consume and expand. And so I honestly think at this point, where no major threat to the Flood exists anymore, their primal urges would take over and they'd turn on humanity to continue their consumption, just like they did in Halo 3 once Truth was dead and the Halos were deactivated. They use us to further their own goals until we're no longer needed, and then we're just next up on the menu. And you know, with their vast numbers and intelligence, this would be a goddamn bloodbath, a red one this time. Hell, with the amount of dissenting colonies the Flood would have infected during the post-war era, they may have even reached the interstellar stage of evolution. Man, I dread to think how many planet-sized gravemind there could be out there. We were only just able to defeat them in the trilogy because we had Installation 08 and Alpha Halo's Index which fit it. We don't know where Installation 08 is. We never went to the library to get the index on either Halo, and we don't even know that the Ark exists. As if it wasn't already abundantly obvious, in this timeline, we don't stand a chance here, we're toast. However, with that said, I'm gonna throw this timeline version of us a proverbial bone. There's a more conspiratorial ending to this story that you could choose to believe if you want to. What if, in a strangely Black Mirror fashion, this Flood outbreak ended up being the Precursor's final test for the mantle for humanity, and in joining forces with them to destroy factions across the galaxy that threatened peace and life, humanity proved themselves as worthy holders of the mantle, passed the test, and the Flood recede to never rear their heads again. Of course it's just a theory, but I think there's definitely room in this timeline to interpret the events as the Precursor's final test, if you choose to. Leave your thoughts on that down below in the comments. So, that's what would happen if we allied with the Flood in Halo 1. Did it play out how you thought it would do, or was it different? Did I miss anything out? That's the problem with these videos, making these what-if scenarios. It's like whack-a-mole. There are so many different moving variables that change. I mean, if you've ever seen the movie Butterfly Effect with Ashton Kutcher about this kind of stuff, you'll understand what I mean. I mean, there's a running joke that if you went back 500 years and kicked a rock or something like that, Albert Einstein would have never been born and the whole world would have been different, right? Like, trying to nail down every single variable is like playing intergalactic whack-a-mole. So I'm doing my best here, but if there's any other loose end that I didn't touch on or that I missed out, leave it down below in the comments and try and resolve it in a realistic way for this timeline. So, with that said, let's round this video out here. I want to give a huge thank you to TAGSTER and Mannequin for becoming new Primordials over on Patreon. My friends, thank you very, very much. You know, the stars have aligned here. What a fitting video for that to be announced, right? What a fitting video. Thank you very much. Also, of course, massive thank you to everybody else who continues to support me over there. And thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I'll catch you all in the next one.